The Battle on the Plains of Abraham of September 13th, 1759, is remembered as the fight where New France lost its North American colonies to Britain during the period historians call the 7 Years' War. This short summary is about the extent of what most Canadians know about the battle. It also contains one of many misconceptions about the battle that Canadians popularly believe are fact. So, today on Historia Nostra, we'll take you on a tour around the historical Plains of Abraham and debunk 5 common misconceptions about the battle and its aftermath along the way. To debunk these historical myths, I met up with an expert in French-Canadian history to talk about the battle and the ways the conquest of New France is commemorated in Quebec City. I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Joseph Gagné, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Windsor in Ontario, currently living in Quebec City, where today we'll be discussing the Battle of the Plains of Abraham.
Before we jump into our historical myths about the battle, a quick clarification for those of you who are wondering.
Why is it called the Plains of Abraham? Now, even myself, until I moved to Quebec, I thought, like most people, it was probably biblical, named after Abraham. But no, the reality is simply named after one of the first settlers of Quebec, who was named Abraham Martin, who was actually Scottish. And so the name just kind of stuck with the Plains, named after Abraham Martin.
So, for Canadians, especially those of us out west, the extent of what we know about the battle can be summarized in 1 or 2 sentences. Probably something like what drag race icon Kyne'a said in this video from October 19th, 2021.
When Canada was colonized hundreds of years ago, control was initially shared between Britain and France, who called this land British North America and New France respectively. Then came the 7 Years' War, and it was on these Plains of Abraham that Britain gained control of New France.
Or, as Joseph says,
when I was a kid, basically the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, you have the French versus the English. They have a battle on the Plains of Abraham. Where is that? No, it's in Quebec. And it's a battle that lasts about, 10 to 15 minutes. That's it. The French lose, and we lose North America.
But that bit where Kyne'a mentioned the 7 Years' War is really important, as Joseph reminds us.
The Battle of the Plains of Abraham is actually just one battle amongst a larger war called the 7 Years' War. Now, in North America, it's a war that lasts from 1754 to 1769. Don't do the math. We're historians, not mathematicians. Yeah. The reason why it's called the 7 Years' War is because officially the war is declared in 1756 in Europe. But in North America, it actually starts 2 years earlier.
So the first myth we're debunking is the idea that France lost its North American colonies during a short and bloody 15-minute battle here in Quebec.
The Battle of the Plains of Abraham is actually just one of 3 sieges that happened. So the British arrive here in June, and the British actually send a quarter of their navy here. That's 49 warships, over 100 merchant ships. And it's actually quite appropriate that we're right next to the St. Lawrence, because it is the entrance of the colony, which gives the French the advantage of going into the inside of North America. But it is also connected to the sea. So even though everyone retains Quebec as the main point, the main culmination of that war, the war was actually won on the ocean. For example, both the St. Lawrence and the Gulf of Mexico both had a British blockade to try to capture as many French ships as possible. In fact, the French lost over 55 ships during the war and had lost over 100 even before the war was officially declared, just on privateer predation on the French merchant ships. And so that is the main issue when a few months after the Battle of Quebec, because remember, we'll just back up for a second. You have the first battle actually happens at the Falls of Montmorency, where Wolfe attempts to take the French entrenchments fails miserably because of low tide and the combination of a rainstorm that just basically ruins their gunpowder in their guns. Then you have the Plains of Abraham on the 13th of September, 1759. But in the spring of 1760, after the British controlled the city of Quebec, the French tried to retake the city. And so back to what I was saying with the ocean, that was the important part, because basically both sides ended up in a standstill. It was an exact reverse of the Plains of Abraham, where now the British are defending, the French are attacking. The British are now pushed away to back into the city, and both sides are waiting for reinforcements. Who's the first one to send reinforcements? And unfortunately for the French, it will be the British. And so that is why we can't forget that, again, as I think I've mentioned earlier, a quarter of the British Navy was sent to Quebec to attack the city. A quarter. That is amazing, considering that this is a war that spanned across not only North America, but India and Africa as well. It is a truly international war. So a quarter just to come attack Quebec, I would almost qualify that as using an elephant gun to come and attack the French, which were unfortunately outnumbered by the British. Now, another point to retain with this, earlier I was mentioning how in elementary school we're taught, it's a battle that lasts 5 to 15 minutes. That is not true at all. That is not true at all, because the actual battle itself, yes, the shooting part where both armies meet each other might have lasted a few minutes while shooting, but the entire day was full of skirmishes and counterattacks and bombardments. And so it is it's very disingenuous to reduce the French failure to just a 15-minute bungle when it is far more complex than that.
Moving further west along the Plains of Abraham, we'll reconvene at Gilmour Hill.
So we're actually standing next to the Gilmour Hill, which is a road that was constructed roughly where the British went up the hill. But a few years ago, as I was mentioning earlier, the Battlefields Commission made a wonderful walking path. So the people visiting Quebec and the locals can roughly also follow the same path that the British followed. Now, of course, this is a much more leisurely walk than back in the day, and I would not recommend anyone. I would actually warn anyone to not try to do what the British did. I tried on the anniversary of the battle this year and scraped my leg pretty badly, and there's a lot of broken beer bottles. Don't try it. I don't recommend it.
And by that you mean climbing up the cliff face?
The actual cliff face, yes. No, so stay on the path, please.
While we're at Gilmour Hill, let's talk about one of Joseph's favorite myths, as he calls it,
the myth of the Traitors. Now, one of my favorite myths to tackle is it's one that we find even to this day in Quebec, in popular media and popular literature, where there would have been a traitor that would have told Wolfe where to climb up at L'Anse au Foulon, which, just to back up a little, Wolfe spent the entire summer trying to figure out how to go up the cliff, because if you actually travel alongside the St. Lawrence towards Quebec, you will notice it's a very stiff, rocky cliff, sometimes a full 90 degrees going straight up. So Quebec was literally a hard nut to crack. And so Wolfe spent the entire summer trying to figure out, well, how will he take Quebec? Because the whole point why the French built Quebec where it stands today was because of that natural fortification, that natural protection. Now, the fact that Wolfe finally went up the cliff with his army led many to speculate, there must have been someone who told him of this path. And so throughout the years, there have been many people that were accused of having committed treason towards their own people. One of the first, of course, is the intended Bigot, because he was basically he was basically profiteering off the government, selling wares at twice, sometimes three times the market value, and pocketing the profits. So some people said, "Oh, obviously it has to be him. He sold the weakness of Quebec to the British." Now, as other historians mentioned, yeah, he might have been a thief, but he was not a traitor by any means. The archivist Pierre Georgeois, at the turn of the century, had his own pet theory based on the testimony of one of Wolfe's soldiers who had named a certain person. The problem is, as much as Roy had held on to that theory, later historians realized, well, that person had actually died 10 years earlier in the Caribbean. So it's kind of hard to be the traitor of Quebec when you're dead. And finally, the most popular person is Vergor, which many people in the Maritimes will remember as being the commander who surrendered Fort Beauséjour in New Brunswick. And for that reason, people imagine, well, he must have had nothing to lose and basically let the British go up the hill, because he was on top of the cliff with around 100 men protecting that small pathway that led to the St. Lawrence. So it seemed kind of odd that someone who had already lost one fort would lose a second time. But the reality is that even his contemporaries praised his efforts at trying to prevent the British from going up the hill. And we also know that he was actually injured. He was shot twice defending it. So so he clearly did not let the British walk by, considering that he viciously fought back and tried to prevent their overtaking of the Plains of Abraham. Mm-hmm. So, and the reality is, and I've studied this question because my doctoral thesis touched upon military intelligence within the French army. And the reality is that you have a situation where Quebec at the time had a population of roughly 8,000 people. Add to that over 7,000 French troops arriving from France. Then you have over 2,000 refugees mostly arriving from Acadia. And eventually you have tripled the population of Quebec, and putting a great strain on the local resources. And so people are hurting. They're hurting bad. They're spending the summer trying to scrounge what they can. It's not exactly starvation, but it's what we call in French disette. So really you're halfway to an actual starvation situation. And so people are desperate to sell their wares, buying reserves and so on. And so we see that in that first winter when the British actually hunker down in Quebec. There are merchants circulating left and right between Quebec and Montreal, and trading secrets between the French and the British. The British themselves have access to ex-prisoners of the city that had a chance to see the layout of the city. And so what you have to retain is that by focusing on the myth of the traitor of Quebec, you're really staring at the tree that's hiding the forest. Wolfe didn't need that single person to give them the magic bullet information. Basically, information was basically being transmitted like through a sieve. There was no need for a single person to give that information. And the column right there marks where James Wolfe was killed. Yeah, so his soldiers had actually rolled a stone to mark the place where he died. So he wasn't shot here, but this is where he died. And then successively they replaced the stone until we got this monument right here. And then over there you get what is called Wolfe's Well.
It's called Wolfe's Well because they brought him water for this well.
Ah.
All right, so leaving Wolfe's Monument behind, we walked away from the park and into the Arts District. If you visited the Plains of Abraham, you might have wondered about how a battle given such an important place in Canadian history could have happened in what is today really a small and sort of hilly park. Well, that ties into our next myth.
So one of the main myths about the Plains of Abraham is that the Plains of Abraham you visit as a kid are the original Plains of Abraham. That's not quite true. They're part of the original Plains of Abraham, but back in 1759, the Plains of Abraham actually stretched clear across the cliff. And so here we are on Cartier Avenue, and you can imagine the British Army, around 4,000 men, just stretching in a thin line from one end to the other, with the French Army the next street over on Salisbury Street, stretching on the other street as well, from one end to the other of the cliff. And so today, what we see is what is left of the Plains of Abraham after the city expanded throughout the years. Yeah, so right now we're actually witnessing a walkathon going on with right next to the Plains of Abraham. But what's interesting to look at, this mass of people actually helps us visualize how many men were on the Plains of Abraham. Because on one hand, even though each side had roughly around 13,000 combatants, on the day of the battle itself, there's roughly 4,000 on each side actually lining up for battle. So if you can imagine just this mass of people on the Plains of Abraham, you get a good, like I said earlier, a good representation of what that could have looked like along one side to the other of the cliff. So just this long line of people waiting to shoot each other.
So possibly one of the most debated aspects of the Battle on the Plains of Abraham is whether or not the French commander, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, made the right call by meeting the British in open battle on the Plains of Abraham. Naturally, there have been some misconceptions about why Montcalm made this choice. I'll let Joseph take it from here.
So another common myth that is quite prominent in Quebec popular memory is that the French in Quebec lost the Battle of the Plains of Abraham because of Montcalm, because he was not Canadian, he was French, therefore he arrived from France. He didn't know what he was doing, he didn't understand how warfare functioned in North America, and so therefore that's how he lost the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Had they given it to someone more competent like the governor of Canada. But the reality is actually quite the opposite, where even though the governor of Quebec, Vaudreuil, is Canadian-born, everyone seems to agree that he was a little naive at how warfare happened. Anytime he's visiting the fortifications, the new fortifications that are being brought up, some of his contemporaries are writing, it looked as if it was the first time he ever looked at a fortification. He's like, this is how this goes, and so on. So there's a lot to be said, and a lot of ink has been poured over this question of Vaudreuil versus Montcalm. For example, we tend to forget, in North America, we always tend to just focus on the 7 Years' War as a North American issue, forgetting what is going on in Europe. And one of the main problems with that is that a lot of the officers and soldiers that arrive into the colony, they are veterans of the previous war, the War of Austrian Succession, Montcalm being one of them. And so one sad thing is that in Canada, people tend to only remember Montcalm's failure at the Plains of Abraham, forgetting all his other successes throughout the war. Montcalm took Oswego. One of his biggest his biggest successes was actually at defending Fort Ticonderoga. Now, as his second in command, he really put it eloquently, all generals are wrong when they lose. And unfortunately, that's how we remember it, because we have that, today, we have the advantage of knowing the consequences of his actions. But at the present moment, we have to avoid presentism and seeing what will happen. We have to look at what was going on at the moment. And even though some people like to say, well, had Montcalm stayed within the walls, he could have successfully resisted against the British. All he had to do was just wait a few more days before the winter started settling in and the British would be forced to leave the St. Lawrence Valley. The reality is that Montcalm knew what he was up against, and took, I wouldn't say a gamble, but took an educated guess, thinking, well, if I was in Wolfe's place, I would set up cannons to bombard the walls. I have to absolutely prevent him from hunkering down, because that's another thing that we tend to forget with these wars of the 18th century. We tend to think of movies like The Patriot and so on, where it's always where you have line battles, two armies facing each other, just shooting. That's just part of warfare back then. Siege warfare is where the attacker will basically entrench themselves, a little bit like World War I with trench warfare, will entrench themselves. And so Montcalm wants to prevent Wolfe from basically, like a turtle, just locking himself into position. And so he took the step that he thought was necessary. Part of that myth also of, had Montcalm followed Canadian military tactics, he would have won, is the fact that he was using also Canadian tactics. One of the biggest myths is the use of what the French call la petite guerre, or the little war, which is basically guerrilla warfare. The only difference being same tactics, but guerrilla warfare is really for revolutionary purposes. When people tend to ask, well, what's the difference? Now, in this case, the common myth here is that guerrilla warfare was a strictly North American invention, learned from indigenous peoples. True, indigenous peoples were masters of guerrilla warfare, but they were not the only ones using it. In fact, France had actually sent 2 specialists in this type of warfare to help the local militiamen train in those methods. And so there's another myth busted, that European warfare was strictly line battles and totally ignored little la petite guerre, which is a total myth.
The last stop on our tour is at the cemetery outside the Hôpital Général, where Montcalm was reburied in 2001. Originally, he'd been buried at the Ursuline Chapel, just northeast of the Citadel.
Here we are in the only remaining cemetery of the 7 Years' War in the world. This is where all of the combatants who died on the Plains of Abraham are buried.
As Joseph points out, even though Montcalm's choices during the battle on the Plains of Abraham have been subject to some historical debate, he continues to be a much celebrated historical figure in Quebec, and a sort of martyr or symbol of resistance to the British conquest of New France.
Even now, you can see that people continue putting flowers on the grave of Montcalm. And so even though these events seem to have been largely forgotten in most Canadian history, most elsewhere in Canada, in Quebec, it remains a perennial memory.
Our final myth, coincidentally, pertains to this graveyard where Montcalm's mausoleum now sits.
One final myth I wish to debunk is the fact that in 2009, there was a few documentaries that were made to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And some of them, some of the commentators had mentioned that this is a Catholic cemetery, which is correct, which meant that the British soldiers that died, those that were not Catholic, would have been buried outside of the cemetery, which is also correct. What was incorrect was stating that they were today buried underneath the road behind the cemetery. That is not true because, and why we know this, because the cemetery got larger through the years. And so the British that were buried outside on the edge of the cemetery are now included within the cemetery on the farther edge. And recent archaeological digs have also shown that there are no military remains that are there.
So there we have it. 5 myths about the battle on the Plains of Abraham debunked. But before we go, I asked Joseph for his thoughts about why this conflict carries so much weight in Canadian historical memory, and particularly in Quebec.
To this day, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham isn't just a mere historical anecdote in Canadian history for the people of the city of Quebec and the province of Quebec. and even further, the French Canadians living outside of the province. I myself am French Canadian from Northern Ontario. The Plains of Abraham still remains a gaping wound in popular memory for many reasons, but it still affects us to this day, even in the very act of trying to commemorate these events. One only has to think of the large reenactment that was supposed to be held in 2009, which was canceled because people were not comfortable with the idea of reliving this battle. Yeah, no, the very question of how the conquest, the 7 Years' War, continues to affect French-Canadian popular memory could be the subject of a whole other video onto itself. Like today we've only scratched the surface by talking about the myths and legends, but there could be an entire series just on how the local population and Canada in general commemorated the 7 Years' War throughout its history.
Basically, the 7 Years' War represents, for French Canadians, Britain's colonization of New France, and for Indigenous North Americans, upon whose territory the French lived, the recolonization of their lands under a new imperial regime. Because we, mistakenly or not, remember the battle on the Plains of Abraham as the moment where France lost her North American colonies to Britain, September 13th, 1759 continues to be an important cultural touchstone. Commemorating this event is tricky, and often we see both sides being celebrated as to not alienate either French or Anglo-Canadians. But as Joseph points out, this commemoration usually forgets something.
What's interesting is if you look in the back, there's this gorgeous statue which was set up, I believe, in 2001 to commemorate the battle. And it is an allegory for the two empires, the British and French, fighting over North America. But as I tell my students when I teach them about the 7 Years' War, there is a missing figure. There should technically be a third figure representing the indigenous peoples of North America, because after all, they're not fighting for the French or for the British, but as allies of each other with their own respective agency, needs, and wants in this war.
Myths about the battle on the Plains of Abraham usually minimize the importance of this event to Canadian history, presenting it as a swift British victory, a bungle on the side of French leadership, or as a win given to the British by a French traitor. These ideas serve to diminish the long and brutal campaign for Quebec that occurred during the 7 Years' War. This was not a minor moment in Canadian history, nor was the conquest of Quebec a brief experience. These were explosive and hugely disruptive battles that deserve to be remembered as such. Special thanks to Joseph Gagné for speaking with us for today's episode. You can learn more about Joseph's work at the links in the description. Footage from October 2021 is courtesy of Ariel Pyatt, and from July, Tyler McTaggart. Our theme music is by Brooke for Free. You can learn more at brookeforfree.bandcamp.com.
So, and there goes my head. Oh, it's still there.
Down there. Let's go.
You are like the most adorable thing ever. You know that?
Come on, Frankie, let's go.
That's on the record.
The video of her with her long eyes. Don't you dare lick my face.